Welcome back. Now, in recent days, nationwide protests over cost of living and President William Ruto's government have overwhelmed the country. Thousands have joined marches called by opposition party against high living costs and alleged fraud in last year's vote. The government has called for the protests to stop. However, the damage to businesses, both in terms of fiscal destruction and the economic standstill that resulted from these protests, could present a challenge to the government. Matt Kindiger, practice leader, Sub-Saharan Africa Frontier View, joins me. Good afternoon, Matt. It's good to have you on the program. Matt, how long are these protests likely to last for?
Hi, well, thank you for having me on the show today. So that is a good question. We are likely to see these protests continue over the coming weeks and maybe even months. There is a regular schedule of protests currently scheduled in the country, and so we would expect there to be some disruption, certainly well into April. But fundamentally, our view is that the protests are going to struggle to change government policy. And also addressing the big elephant in the room, which is the question of, or accusations of, fraud in the election, which is difficult to verify. And this means that the election is unlikely to be overturned. So we expect Mr. Ruto's government to remain in seat, unlikely to make significant policy changes. And this does mean that the protests will likely peter out over the next couple of months. You know, certainly some risk of disruption, but probably going to see a bit of an easing going forwards. Having said all of this, there is going to be quite considerable uncertainty, especially businesses that are most vulnerable to what's going on at the moment.
Speaking of businesses and vulnerability, how disruptive will the protest be on Kenya's economic growth this year? We're seeing that the Private Sector Alliance has said that each day of the protest, the aftermath costs about 3 billion Kenyan shillings. How quickly do you think Kenya is going to be able to recover from this?
Yes, so the crucial question is how long these protests go on for. So the longer the protests go on for, the more disruptive they are. Certainly, we will be downgrading our growth view for Kenya's economic outlook this year. We have already downgraded our growth view for Kenya before these protests started, and this is because the country is struggling with foreign currency shortages. It's also facing higher inflation and quite significant fiscal pressures. The government's finances are not in great shape. Having said all of this, you know, assuming that the protests actually come to an end relatively soon, the Kenyan economy does have a track record of bouncing back from periods of social unrest quite quickly. Kenya enjoys a very broad-based or an increasingly diversified economy. We are seeing very resilient activity, or we had seen at least until the protest started, in services. So in particular, ICT, financial services, healthcare, education, even hospitality doing quite well. So provided that the protests end relatively quickly, we are still expecting to see the economy deliver about 4% growth this year. However, if the protests do continue, we're probably going to be downgrading this closer to 2 or 3%.
More downgrades for the country, but to what extent has the shilling's recent sharp depreciation been linked to the protests?
So I would say only partly. Certainly, social unrest in Kenya is likely contributing to the depreciation of the shilling in global currency markets. It's creating a bit of investor anxiety. But in our view, this recent depreciation of the shilling, especially against major currencies like the dollar, is a result of much more long-standing fundamental macroeconomic challenges that the country is facing. Our view is that the Central Bank of Kenya has been trying to control the currency's value and intervene into the currency markets in Kenya, and this is for a number of reasons. One is to limit inflationary pressures, especially in terms of imported inflation. The other is to contain the government's debt servicing costs. The government's fiscal position is not great, and it is very vulnerable to a rise in the cost of servicing debt in dollars, especially in dollar-denominated debt. This has not really become sustainable in our view, however, and the central bank is relenting to pressure because of very extreme foreign currency shortages that have emerged, and that is also really damaging business. So it's a combination of what's happening immediately, but also some longer-standing trends where the central bank had previously resisted depreciation of the shilling. We are expecting the shilling to average close to 140 against the dollar this year, probably ending the year between 140, 150, and maybe even 160 by December.
We do hope the hardship, the current crisis in Kenya is abated very quickly, Matt. Thanks so much for joining us, Matt Kinniger, Practice Leader, Sub-Saharan Africa, Frontier View, for your thoughts on the program.
Thanks for having me on the show.